What if everything you've been told about protein, and especially plant-based protein, is only half the story? I am 98 years old, and I have watched generations argue over meat, milk, and muscle as if strength were something that could only be carved out of an animal. But I stand here, still able to lift my own weight, still walking without assistance, still carrying groceries up a flight of stairs, and I can tell you this: the truth about protein is not as simple as people want it to be. When I was a young man, strength was measured in visible ways: how much you could lift, how long you could work, how fast you recovered. Back then, no one questioned animal protein. Meat was considered the gold standard, the unquestioned foundation of muscle. If you wanted to be strong, you ate meat. If you didn't, people assumed you would weaken over time. That belief was not based on careful biology, it was based on tradition. But over the decades, I began to notice something unusual. Some of the strongest, most resilient individuals I met were not eating as much animal protein as expected. Farmers who relied heavily on beans and grains, laborers who built their bodies on lentils, rice, and soy. At first I dismissed it. I thought perhaps they were exceptions. But exceptions, when repeated enough times, are no longer exceptions. They are signals. So I began to observe more carefully, not as a scientist in a laboratory, but as a man paying attention to cause and effect in real life. I noticed that muscle was not just about how much protein you consumed, but how your body used it. I saw men eating large amounts of meat but still losing strength as they aged. I saw others eating simpler, plant-based diets who maintained lean muscle well into their later years. That contradiction stayed with me. Years later, when science began to explain what I had been witnessing, it finally made sense. Protein is not a single entity. It is a collection of amino acids. And muscle is not built by protein alone, but by a process called muscle protein synthesis, which depends on the availability, balance, and timing of those amino acids. This is where the debate truly begins. Plant-based protein has often been criticized for being incomplete, for lacking certain essential amino acids, or for being less digestible. And on the surface, that criticism is not entirely wrong. But it is incomplete, just like the belief that meat alone guarantees strength. Because the real question is not whether plant protein is perfect. The real question is whether it can support the biological process required to maintain and build muscle. And that is the truth I have spent decades uncovering, not through ideology, but through observation, experience, and eventually understanding. If you are willing to question what you've been told, then what I am about to share with you may change how you think about strength for the rest of your life. Let me take you deeper, because this is where most people stop thinking. They hear that plant protein is incomplete, and they conclude the case is closed. But biology does not work in slogans. It works in mechanisms, thresholds, and systems interacting over time. At the center of this discussion is something called muscle protein synthesis, or MPS. This is the process by which your body repairs and builds muscle tissue. Every time you move, lift, strain, or even maintain posture, tiny amounts of muscle damage occur. Your body responds by rebuilding that tissue stronger if it has the right raw materials. Those raw materials are amino acids, especially the essential ones your body cannot produce on its own. Now, here is the critical point. Not all protein sources deliver these amino acids in the same way. Animal protein, meat, eggs, dairy, typically contains all 9 essential amino acids in proportions that closely match human needs. This is why it has been labeled complete. It also tends to have higher digestibility scores, meaning your body can absorb and utilize a larger percentage of what you consume. Scientists measure this using systems like PDCAAS and DIAAS, which evaluate both amino acid composition and digestibility. Plant protein, on the other hand, often has two perceived disadvantages. First, individual plant sources may be lower in one or more essential amino acids. For example, grains are typically lower in lysine, while legumes may be lower in methionine. Second, plant proteins can be slightly less digestible due to fiber and anti-nutritional factors like phytates. On paper, this makes plant protein appear inferior. But here is where the misunderstanding begins. The human body does not evaluate protein one meal at a time in isolation. It evaluates intake across the day, across combinations of foods, and across total quantity. When you combine different plant sources, rice with beans, lentils with grains, soy with vegetables, you create what is called complementary proteins. The amino acids that are low in one food are supplied by another. Over the course of a day, the body receives a complete amino acid profile. More importantly, muscle protein synthesis is not triggered simply by the presence of protein. It is triggered by reaching a certain threshold, especially of an amino acid called leucine. Leucine acts as a signal. When enough of it is present in the bloodstream, it activates the pathway that tells your body to build muscle. This is often referred to as the leucine threshold. Animal proteins tend to reach this threshold more easily because they are more concentrated in leucine. A smaller portion can effectively stimulate MPS. Plant proteins, in many cases, contain less leucine per gram. This means you may need to consume a slightly larger quantity to achieve the same effect. But needing more does not mean it cannot be done. It simply means the strategy must be adjusted. I learned this not from textbooks, but from watching my own body change over time. In my 60s, I began reducing my intake of meat, not out of principle, but out of necessity. Digestion became heavier, recovery slower. I started incorporating more legumes, more whole grains, more soy. At first, I noticed a drop in energy. That was my mistake. I had reduced one source without understanding how to replace it properly. So I adjusted. I increased total protein intake slightly. I paid attention to combinations: beans with rice, lentils with whole grains, tofu with vegetables. I unknowingly began applying the very principles science would later confirm. And something interesting happened. My strength stabilized. Then it improved again. What most people fail to understand is that muscle health is not determined by protein alone. It is influenced by the entire metabolic environment of the body. Plant-based diets tend to come with higher fiber, more antioxidants, and lower levels of saturated fat. This affects inflammation, insulin sensitivity, and overall metabolic efficiency. When your body is less inflamed and more responsive to nutrients, it can utilize protein more effectively. There is also the matter of aging. As we grow older, our bodies become less responsive to protein intake. a phenomenon known as anabolic resistance. This means older adults need more protein, not less, to stimulate the same level of muscle protein synthesis. Many people interpret this as a reason to rely exclusively on animal protein. But that is not the only solution. It is one solution. The other solution is precision. Higher total intake, better distribution throughout the day, and strategic food combinations. For example, instead of consuming most of your protein in one meal, spreading it across 3 or 4 meals can maintain a more consistent stimulation of MPS. Including protein sources rich in leucine, such as soy, lentils, chickpeas, can help reach that activation threshold. I remember a man I worked with in my 70s. He was 10 years younger than me, but moved like he was 20 years older. He ate meat at every meal, believed it was the only path to strength. Yet he complained constantly about fatigue and joint stiffness. I, on the other hand, had shifted toward a more plant-focused diet, not perfectly, but intentionally. Over time, the difference between us became visible. Not dramatic, not immediate, but undeniable. This is not to say that plant protein is automatically superior. That would be another form of oversimplification. Poorly planned plant-based diets can lead to insufficient protein intake, inadequate amino acid balance, and ultimately muscle loss. I have seen that as well. People who remove animal products without understanding replacement strategies often struggle. They blame the diet when in reality the issue is implementation. The truth, as I have come to understand it, is conditional. Plant-based protein can support muscle health effectively, but only when certain conditions are met. Total intake must be sufficient. Amino acid diversity must be ensured. Meals must be structured to reach the leucine threshold, and consistency must be maintained over time. There is also the role of resistance. Muscle is not built by protein alone. It is built by demand. Without physical stimulus, lifting, carrying resistance, no amount of protein, plant or animal, will preserve muscle. I have seen men consume high-protein diets while living sedentary lives, and their muscles still deteriorated. Protein provides the material, but movement provides the signal. Even now, at 98, I do not rely on theory. I rely on practice. I move every day. I eat with awareness. I ensure that my meals contain enough protein, not excessively, but deliberately. And I have found that my body responds not to ideology, but to consistency and balance. Science today supports much of what I learned through observation. Studies comparing plant and animal protein show that when total protein intake is matched and when plant proteins are properly combined or supplemented, the differences in muscle gain and strength are minimal. The gap that once seemed so large begins to close under controlled conditions. But most people are not living under controlled conditions. They are living under habits, assumptions, and partial truths. That is where the real problem lies, not in the protein itself, but in how it is understood and applied. So when someone asks me, can plant-based protein really support muscle health? I do not answer with a simple yes or no. I tell them this. It depends on how you use it. because strength is not built from a single ingredient. It is built from a system, and the moment you understand that system, everything changes. By the time I reached my 80s, I had stopped asking which protein was better, and I began asking a more precise question. Under what conditions does each protein actually work? That shift in thinking changed everything. Because when you move from belief to mechanism, from assumption to structure, you stop arguing and you start building. Let us go deeper into what truly determines muscle health, because this is where most people fail without realizing it. The body does not store protein the way it stores fat or carbohydrates. There is no reservoir of amino acids waiting for future use. Every day, your body is in a constant state of breakdown and rebuilding. This is called protein turnover. Muscle protein synthesis builds tissue, while muscle protein breakdown degrades it. Your strength, your muscle mass, your resilience, all of it depends on which side of that equation is winning over time. Now, here is the critical reality. Simply consuming protein does not guarantee that synthesis will exceed breakdown. The body requires a specific signal to shift into a building state. That signal, as I mentioned earlier, is largely driven by leucine. But leucine alone is not enough. It must arrive within a full spectrum of essential amino acids, and it must be supported by energy, by hormones, and by physical demand. When I began relying more on plant-based protein, I had to learn this the hard way. I remember a period in my early 70s when I thought I was eating healthy, plenty of vegetables, grains, and some legumes, but I was not paying attention to total protein intake. I felt lighter, yes, but also weaker. My grip strength declined. My recovery slowed. That was my second mistake. I had improved one aspect of my diet while neglecting another. So I began to measure, not with instruments, but with awareness. I increased my intake of protein-rich plant foods deliberately. I made sure every meal contained a meaningful source. Lentils at lunch, tofu or tempeh at dinner, nuts and seeds in between. I did not rely on chance. I constructed my meals with intention, and gradually the balance shifted again. My strength returned. This is where many people misunderstand plant protein. They treat it as a passive component of the diet, something that will take care of itself. But plant protein requires design. It requires awareness of density because many plant foods are less concentrated in protein compared to animal sources. You may need a larger volume of food to achieve the same total intake. That is not a flaw. It is a structural difference. There is also the matter of digestibility, which is often exaggerated but not irrelevant. Yes, some plant proteins are slightly less digestible due to fiber and natural compounds. But cooking, soaking, fermenting, these processes significantly improve bioavailability. Traditional cultures understood this long before modern science explained it. They soaked beans, fermented soy, prepared grains carefully. They were not just cooking, they were optimizing. I adopted many of those practices without even realizing their scientific basis. I soaked my legumes, cooked them thoroughly, included fermented foods like tempeh. Over time, my digestion improved, and so did my energy. This is another piece people overlook. If your body cannot efficiently digest what you eat, then the theoretical quality of that food becomes irrelevant. Now let us address the issue that causes the most confusion: muscle growth versus muscle maintenance. These are not identical processes. Building new muscle especially in younger individuals or in response to intense training, requires a more robust stimulation of muscle protein synthesis. In those cases, the efficiency of protein source becomes more noticeable. Animal protein may provide a more direct route to reaching that leucine threshold, but maintenance, especially in aging, is a different challenge. The goal is not necessarily to build large amounts of new muscle, but to prevent loss, to maintain function, mobility, and independence. In this context, plant protein can be highly effective when used correctly. The difference is not in possibility, but in precision. I have lived long enough to see men chase extremes. Some consume excessive amounts of protein, believing more is always better. Others avoid protein out of fear, focusing only on clean eating. Both approaches fail, just in different ways. Excess protein, especially when paired with low activity, does not automatically translate into muscle. It can place unnecessary strain on metabolic systems without providing additional benefit. On the other hand, insufficient protein leads to gradual muscle loss, weakness, and increased vulnerability with age. The balance lies in adequacy, not excess, not deficiency. And for plant-based diets, adequacy requires planning. Not complicated planning, but conscious planning. Knowing that a bowl of rice alone is not enough. Knowing that adding beans transforms it into a complete protein source. Knowing that soy, in its various forms, offers one of the most complete plant-based profiles available. There is another factor I came to respect deeply: timing. When you consume protein matters almost as much as how much you consume. The body responds best to moderate doses of protein distributed throughout the day. Large, infrequent intakes are less effective at sustaining muscle protein synthesis. This is particularly important for older individuals whose bodies are less sensitive to anabolic signals. So I changed my pattern. Instead of one large protein-heavy meal, I ensured that each meal contributed meaningfully. Breakfast was no longer just carbohydrates, it included protein. Lunch was balanced. Dinner was not excessive, but sufficient. This created a rhythm, a consistent stimulation of muscle maintenance throughout the day. And then there is movement, the most underestimated variable in this entire equation. Without resistance, without challenge, the body has no reason to maintain muscle. I have seen people obsess over protein intake while neglecting the very stimulus that makes protein useful. Muscle is not built in the kitchen alone. It is built in response to demand. Even now, I maintain simple forms of resistance. Carrying weight, rising from a seated position without assistance, holding posture under load. These are not exercises in the modern sense, but they are stimuli. They tell the body this tissue is still needed. And when that signal is combined with adequate protein, the system works. Over time, I stopped thinking in terms of plant versus animal. I began thinking in terms of function. Does this meal provide enough amino acids? Does it reach the threshold required to stimulate synthesis? Is my body in a state where it can use what I provide? Those questions are far more important than the label attached to the food. Science, once again, has caught up to these observations. Controlled studies show that when total protein intake is equalized, strongest, and when plant proteins are properly structured, either through combination or supplementation, the differences in muscle outcomes become small. Not non-existent, but small enough that other factors, training, total calories, consistency, play a larger role. But the real world is not a laboratory. In the real world, people are inconsistent. They skip meals. They rely on convenience. They follow trends without understanding principles. That is why so many fail, regardless of whether they choose plant or animal protein. The issue is not the source, it is the system. At 98, I do not argue with people about diets anymore. I simply observe. I see who maintains strength, who loses it, and how they live. And the pattern is always the same. Those who understand their bodies, not perfectly but intentionally, maintain function far longer. Those who rely on assumptions decline sooner. So, if you ask me again after all these years what the truth is about plant-based protein and muscle health, I will tell you this. It is not inferior, but it is not automatic. It demands awareness. It demands structure. And if you are willing to provide that, your body will respond, not to the label of the protein, but to the biology of how it is used. So after nearly a century of watching bodies rise, decline, adapt, and sometimes fail, what is the final truth? It is simpler than most people expect and more demanding than most people want. Plant-based protein can support muscle health. That is no longer a question. The evidence exists, and I have lived it, but it does not do so by accident. It does not forgive carelessness. It does not compensate for misunderstanding. It rewards precision. If you remember nothing else from what I have told you, remember this: your body does not recognize labels like plant or animal. It recognizes amino acids, energy, and stimulus. It responds to thresholds, to consistency, to signals repeated over time. Everything else, beliefs, trends, arguments, is noise layered on top of biology. The mistake most people make is thinking in absolutes. They want a clear winner. They want to be told that one source is superior, that one choice guarantees strength. But the body does not operate on ideology. It operates on systems. And any system, when misunderstood, will fail, even if the individual parts are good. If you choose plant-based protein, then you must respect its structure. You must ensure sufficient intake. You must combine sources when necessary. You must reach the thresholds that trigger muscle protein synthesis. You must distribute your intake across the day. And above all, you must move. Because without demand, there is no reason for your body to maintain strength. If you fail in any of these areas, you may conclude that plant protein does not work. But what has truly failed is not the protein. It is the application. I have seen strong men weaken because they relied on assumptions. I have seen older individuals regain stability because they paid attention to detail. The difference was never the label of the diet. It was the awareness behind it. At 98, I no longer chase strength in the way I once did. I do not measure progress by how much I can lift, but by how well I can live. Can I stand without assistance? Can I carry what I need? Can I move without fear? These are the real markers of muscle health. And they are still within my reach, not because I chose one type of protein over another, but because I learned how to use what I eat. So the truth is not that plant-based protein is equal or inferior. The truth is conditional. It becomes effective when used correctly and ineffective when used carelessly. That is not a limitation. It is a responsibility. And if you are willing to accept that responsibility, to move beyond simple answers and into understanding, then your body will give you something far more valuable than strength alone. It will give you time. Time with mobility, time with independence, time with dignity. That, in the end, is the only outcome that truly matters.